Let's talk about systemic inequality, theories and solutions. You probably know that the more free market economies in the world tend to have higher inequality levels. Let's explore that. The idea that rising inequality is sort of natural in a free market system is a well-known narrative, but we need to be careful because what is a free market system? Is there any sort of natural free market system? I would echo Ha-Joon Chang, who argues there is no such thing as a free market system. Or before him, John Stuart Mill, who says there is no system that humans have made that is not somehow touched and manipulated by their preferences, and these change over time. There's always guardrails around decisions. For instance, in the US, we're not legally allowed to eat horse meat, but in other countries there are. With this important caveat in mind, let's proceed. Since most earnings come from wages, to understand income inequality, we'll need to understand wage inequality. Wages are the price of labor, simply put. The demand and supply for labor sets wage, or the price of labor. It's easy to see, by the way, that the demand for labor is derived from the demand for the good that is produced by the labor. So to some extent, the price of labor, or the wage rate, depends on society's desire for the product that labor creates. A natural extension of this is that wage differentials are fair and just and earned. Oh, but friends, there is a great counter-argument, one we need to consider. This is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that neoclassical free market economic theory doesn't help explain a lot of wages, but it can't fully do so. So let's talk about this. We'll need to unpack this a little bit. A minute ago, we talked briefly about how the demand for labor is derived from the demand for goods that labor produces. If a worker is more productive and earns more money for her firm than someone else, we would think that her marginal productivity is higher and her wage should be higher. This should hold true between people and between industries. More productive workers should be in higher demand, and therefore, other things equal, their wages should be higher. The fact that we still see gender and ethnicity as very large explainers of very large wage gaps pokes holes in the theory that it's productivity differences that explain most income inequality. A related idea, and indeed a source of large differences in people's productivity, is education. Some like to think that education is a big explainer of income inequality, and indeed there's some evidence there. But if we look at the change in average household income for the top 1%, it's clear that they're doing a heck of a lot better than just straight workers with advanced degrees. Indeed, hedge fund managers have the same amount of education as high school teachers, and they are killing it compared to everyone else. Back to the idea that worker productivity should track with their wages. We'll look at several pieces of data here, but you can see that since about 1980, productivity has diverged from compensation. Here's another look. The gap gets particularly large after 2000. What do you think's going on? They were tracking pretty well. Then things started to come apart, and then they really fell apart. Okay, so are there any other trends happening that might explain some of this divergence? Economists are thinking more and more that it has to do with rising corporate concentration. Evidence includes rising profits, right? Rising return on capital in recent years, and more U.S. companies doing really well on capital returns compared to historic periods. There's an important idea called the bargaining theory of wages. It holds that wages, hours, working conditions, and anything that can be determined by the interaction of employer and employee together depends on the bargaining strength of each side. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, even hinted at something like this when he noted that employers have greater bargaining strength than employees and will always use this to their advantage. The flip side of the trend toward rising corporate profits and larger firms, or what we might call corporate concentration, is that of the national income, there's just less left for workers. So here we see the labor share of income in the non-farm business sector. It's declining in the last few decades. And whenever you see graphs like this, by the way, the vertical bars indicate recession. And here's some more industry-specific data about which industries are getting larger. You can see lots of mergers have made lots of large firms even larger. If this topic interests you, and it does interest many business majors, I would recommend reading Alan Krueger on the topic. He was an important economist who did a lot of great and very readable work on minimum wage and the effects of rising corporate power on economic outcomes. He also wrote about solutions. Sadly, we lost Alan Krueger far too young in 2019. So let's break it down. What are the economic theories about rising market power, like monopolies or monopsonies, and how does that cause wages to stagnate or fall? So a monopoly is a single seller, and the known predictable market outcome economic theory is that when you have a monopoly, rather than a more competitive firm, prices will rise and quantity will fall. Because we're focusing on the labor market to understand wages, let's think about a single seller of labor. So a single seller of labor might be like LeBron James, somebody who's basically alone in the market. Nobody else has anything to offer that's similar. Or a labor union is another way of thinking about a single seller, all workers banded under one bargaining unit. A monopsony is a single buyer. And under a single buyer, economic theory says that quantity falls and prices paid to inputs fall. So when we're talking about a monopsony in the labor market, we're thinking about like a small town with one large employer, Walmart, a small town where there's just one hospital, and so all the nurses and doctors work for this one powerful employer. Well, that powerful employer is going to have the ability to push down wages because those workers really have no other options. So when the firm has more power than the worker and can grab a larger share of the profit without incident, that's perhaps what we're seeing. Again, back to Adam Smith and bargaining theory. Believe it or not, we have another audio clip of Adam Smith. Masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. All right, so I hope you're finding this theory interesting. If so, what are the sources of this monopsony power, this increasing bargaining power of the employers in the labor market? Some of it's policy and Justice Department rulings that allow for more market concentration. We do have in the U.S. antitrust law or anti-monopoly law since 1890, but it's always up for judicial interpretation. So get judges and get, people in place that interpret the laws in a more business-friendly way, and you're going to get market concentration like we're getting. Employer collusion, it's illegal under antitrust law for firms to combine in restriction of competition, but they do it all the time. They just don't get caught. So price fixing and other stuff like that, we know is going on all the time. It's a way to increase profit, right? Non-compete contracts, this is where as an employee you might sign something that says, I agree not to work for a competitor or to entertain job offers from a competitor for a while. This reduces your bargaining power and in the state of California is illegal or it's at least not enforceable. So go ahead and sign those things. You are not bound by them. But a lot of firms will ask that you sign them. So that's just know that they hold no power over you. Surge costs and other labor market frictions. Look, labor is not the most mobile of resources. We have families, we have preferences of where we like to live, and so it's not as easy to pick up and move to, say, North Dakota or wherever the jobs are, just because we face friction as human beings. Job lock. You might need to keep that job even though it's a bad fit or even though you hate it or even though you're paying getting paid very little because you get benefits with it, or you have to take care of your aging parents or whatever that thing is. You're sort of locked in for some reason and you can't get away. Any regulations that limit worker mobility, for instance, licensing regulations that differ from state to state. One last thing here is, among many things, a culture that we have in the U.S. of not discussing salaries with each other. So it's what happens is that we sort of don't know how little sometimes we're getting paid compared to other people, and we don't. That we therefore have less power as a result. So thinking about solutions, you want to just reverse all those things, right? You want to relax land use regulations. You want stronger enforcement of antitrust law. You want more relaxed occupational license requirements. You'd want maybe some sort of portable health care where you're no longer locked into a job because that's the only place you can get your health care insurance. Sick leave also, right? Makes you able to move around a little bit more. Promoting pay transparency, reducing the use of non-compete contracts. These are all towards solutions. And further policy recommendations might include strengthening the actual laws about antitrust, perhaps strengthening protection for workers' unions. This starting in the late 70s and through the 80s, unions in the U.S. were dealt some policy blows by first by Carter and then in a large part by Ronald Reagan as president. Increase minimum wage or living wage laws. Alan Kruger, again, has done a lot of work around minimum wage, proving that in conditions of monopsony and in large corporate presence in most of these markets, raising minimum wage does nothing to increase unemployment. So when you have large, powerful corporations, increasing minimum wage has little to no effect on creating the unemployment that the simple Econ 101 narrative would have us to believe. Price controls on CEO wages, these sometimes are tried. This is pretty controversial, but that's something that could be done. Other things to sort of reduce costs for workers, like rent controls, and again, zoning laws, or in this case specifically for more housing supply. And another investigation into how the system of free market capitalism might produce inequality and that inequality might grow over time is down to Thomas Piketty, a French economist whose book Capital has really taken the world by storm. And you can read the book, although it is a very long book, or you can look at people like Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner, discussing Piketty and summarizing Piketty like we have in our readings. But basically the idea is that the return on capital, little r, is going to outpace the growth rate of the world economy, little g, over time, and that's going to increase. So here's some data from John Cassidy at the New Yorker, also a great economist. And you can see that there's historical periods here, but after the World War II period, we see this divergence of R and G again. Piketty argues this is the natural state for capitalism, to provide higher rates of return for capital than for everybody else. And to get in depth with this theory, you're going to have to read the book or look at the summaries. But basically, an interesting question would be like, why does it decline? Why do we have a drop in the rate of return to capital? How come this inequality actually dropped for a while? And to answer that, we need to look at policy. In that same period, one of the big policies was this huge increase in individual income tax that has come down. And although recently corporate income tax rates have dropped again, you can see basically we're living in, for personal income tax, a fairly low tax situation historically. So policy is important. Policy and policy changes can and do have large effects on inequality. So if you wanted to reverse this rising inequality that Piketty argues is sort of natural in capitalism, you'd want to implement policies that reduced the wealth inequality, so maybe put taxes on wealth, maybe establish a robot tax. Bill Gates suggests this, right? So as capital or machines and equipment, remember that's the economist's definition of capital, owners of capital are getting more and more, so maybe they pay a higher and higher tax. And the justification for this is they did not create the wealth from robots on their own. It's sort of perhaps partly down to them, but it's partly down to the society that created the infrastructure and created the education. And the rising rate of return for capital is not necessarily all chalked up to them. So taxing them and dispersing that to a wider part of the citizens is the way that you might get this reversed. Universal basic income. This is something that was floated in the 60s, has been coming up again recently as a way to put a floor under people's income. If this is natural, that R is going to surpass G by a greater and greater margin, inequality is going to be rising, and universal basic income is a solution to that in part. The rise of winner-take-all markets. Sorry about the Taylor Swift for some of you. The rise of winner-take-all markets is important here too. The internet has definitely empowered the top few performers in the entertainment field to gather all of the revenue, right? There's not room for everybody anymore. It's just too easy to share, too easy. There's not enough bandwidth for us to listen to 50 different bands, so we listen to 3 bands. So we pay attention to 3 actors, right? There just isn't enough room for everybody in the market. So the top few performers get a ton of money, and the rest of the 98% of the performers get very little. Policy recommendations, nothing. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It just is an explanation for rising income inequality. Likewise, you're going to see economists not really want to stop technological progress, even though it creates winners and losers. Some people get thrown out of a job, but we don't want to turn back the clock on technological progress because the benefits outweigh the costs. That is not to say that we should not help the people cast aside by technology. So workers who are replaced by machines, absolutely, out of the winnings of technological progress, there's more than enough to compensate people whose jobs are lost by technological progress. In fact, that's a theme that economists will use quite a bit, and that is, let's not stop trade, let's not stop progress, but out of the winnings, let's compensate the people who've lost. We don't want to change the market, but we want to compensate those who, through no fault of their own, are losing because of it. And who are the winners? Well, as Piketty says, the owners of capital, and also, at least historically, white-collar workers and high-tech and high-skilled workers whose productivity is enhanced by robots and machines. Although, as machines get better, more and more types of workers, even higher-skilled workers, will be losing their jobs. What we don't know is what new jobs will be created. It's impossible to know if technological progress will cause widespread unemployment or not. So again, in the policy recommendations here, robot tax, universal basic income, these show up again. Other types of redistribution towards those whose jobs are lost because of winner-take-all markets or because of technological progress. Again, assisting workers in transitioning to new jobs is key. And it's worth thinking of the long term. So some of the dangers that we've started to see with rising inequality is that it cements the system of inequality, that inequality begets more inequality. So we've already looked at how inequality in earnings tends to be positively correlated with intergenerational inequality. And some of the transmission mechanisms might be this cultural fairness tends to have policies that reduce inequality and promote mobility. We know there's political winds that move the other direction with rising inequality. Those at the top have a desire and increased power to protect their positions. Again, a look at relative mobility from data from 2006. If you want the American dream, you need to move to Denmark. So thinking about the political aspects and policy recommendations there, again, stronger enforcement of existing antitrust laws would be helpful. Campaign finance reform that limits the amount of lobbying to Congress would be great. Reversal of Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court, where corporations can give unlimited funds to campaigns, would be crucial. Preventing voter suppression that we've seen in recent years would be helpful. And preventing gerrymandering, redistricting by politicians for their own self-interest. There's a lot of interesting policy prescriptions beyond this list for helping to improve the state of politics in the U.S. And last but not least, it's worth noting that the modern economic system is just simply subject to shocks. You're looking here at real gross domestic product, or adjusted for inflation, the amount of output and therefore income that the U.S. economy has done. You can see again those vertical gray bars are recessions. So it's going to take a dive right here, but you can see basically that it is not a stable system. Modern specialized economies never are. They're very unstable. So that can be good when times are good. The good times are amplified, but when the bad times happen, the bad times are also amplified. We all depend on each other for income. And these bad times, of course, have ramifications for inequality and poverty. The COVID-19 recession does not affect all income groups the same. More on that later. But what can the federal government do? The federal government and federal policymakers. Here you're looking at the Federal Reserve effective federal funds rate. How many times can I say federal in 30 seconds? So we're looking here at some of the main policies that the U.S. Policymakers are doing right now, and that is controlling interest rates. When there's a recession, interest rates drop because spending is dropping, and so we're trying to make interest rates lower so people feel good about borrowing and spending. So we want to stimulate spending. You can see after the Great Recession, we have interest rates stay low, and then the economy is improving, so interest rates creep back up. This is all done by policymakers. And then, oops, we hit the COVID-19 sorrows, and interest rates are now back at zero. So there's a lot. This is monetary policy, and there's a lot that the federal government can do also with fiscal policy. We're seeing massive injections of money into the U.S. economy for the COVID-19 recession. And this is something that also has ramifications for inequality and poverty, even though it's not specific to those things.